Just the opening lyrics of Psalm 23, David has made it pretty clear that only God can pull this off. Only Yahweh is capable of giving you satisfaction. Only the Lord can make it possible to lie down in green pastures. Only the Lord can carve the inlet in the midst of stormy waters so you can drink from still water. Only the Lord can consistently see where you've fallen and pick you up every time you fall and put you back on your feet. Only the Lord is capable of leading you in ruts of rightness with God. Only the Lord is capable of protecting you as you walk through those dark, shadowy valleys. Only the Lord is capable of holding you accountable with His rod where He sees beyond the wall and cares for you as if He holds your hand with His staff. Those are the first 4 stanzas of this song. Now let's go to the 5th, somewhat surprising stanza of Psalm 23, where David writes, "You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies." Now don't miss that. Sheep following the Lord end up surrounded by enemies. You would think that he would say, because I'm following you, there are no enemies anymore. Anywhere. But yet he says, you prepare a table before me in the very presence as if surrounded by my enemies. But it's interesting, instead of cowering in fear, David's talking about eating a feast. Our sermons are translated into a couple of different languages. That's interesting to me, the way they translate this. Swahili and Spanish, both of those take this word for table and use the word mesa. Gives us a good idea of what he's talking about. David is more than likely referring to a high summer range, a mesa. And don't miss this, there's obviously a caring, energetic, careful shepherd who has taken the time and the trouble to prepare a mesa for the arrival of his flock. He's not just going to take them up there and cut them loose. Once again, David is bragging about the care of his shepherd who's been hard at work. Philip Keller in his wonderful book says, "I remember taking my young children and making a game out of the long hours when we would pull on those upper ranges, the mesas before the flocks would arrive, pull poisonous weeds." He told how in one field in the spring it would always bloom with beautiful, attractive white camas flowers. Attractive, but deadly to sheep. He wrote this, and I quote him, "If lambs in particular eat or even just nibble a few of the lily-like leaves emerging in the spring grasses, they will become paralyzed, stiffen up like blocks of wood, and succumb to the toxic poison from the plant and die." So we spent hours pulling these from the ground. So when you read, there's this green pasture, now you have this high tableland, this mesa, it's prepared. The shepherd has done the work. And the dangers multiply. Not only are there dangerous things for sheep to eat, there are dangerous things that eat sheep, right? David says, I'm in the will of God, surrounded by enemies. And those enemies would be in things that I shouldn't eat and things that will eat me. One author said this in his observations in working with Middle Eastern shepherds: "A careful shepherd will inspect the field for vipers, small little brown snakes that live under the ground, poisonous vipers that will nip the sheep on their noses as they graze, causing inflammation, and if the sheep are younger, little lambs, even death." Timothy Laniak added, "While shepherds watch their flocks at night, so do the wolves. It's a nightly match of waiting, watching, and outwitting." He wrote, "I have seen Middle Eastern shepherds spend all night shouting, whistling, throwing stones in all directions from their slings because they knew the wolves were out there who would cause continual losses." And again, the sheep can't defend themselves. They need a shepherd. And when the shepherd is there, what's fascinating is the way that David writes with this sense of utter calm. Look again, you prepare a mesa before me, right in the middle of my enemies. In other words, from their hiding places, the canyon walls, they're hidden in the shadows, they're watching. But here's a picture of peace. The Lord isn't panicking. Hey, look, I've prepared a meal for you. Eat, hurry. We just got a few minutes, like in the cafeteria. You got 20 minutes and you got to get out of there, right? Not this sense at all. Take your time. There's no hurry. Enjoy the meal I've prepared for you, even though you're surrounded. I've gotten a picture of this from the different culture represented by our future son-in-law, our daughter Candace. Oldest daughter is getting married in about 8 weeks. And she met her husband-to-be on the mission field in Santiago, where she was doing a short stint for ABWE, teaching in an academy. And he's now here. They're going to live in the States. And some of the funny moments we've had have typically been around the meal because of the cultural differences that tend to show up there more than just about anywhere else. His culture takes several hours to eat dinner. You take a bite and you talk. You take another bite and you sit and talk. And it can take hours. No rushing, no hurry. On Sundays in Santiago, all of his family would gather at his uncle's home, and lunch would last all afternoon as they would eat and talk. He was absolutely shocked his first Sunday dinner in our home. Marcia had prepared this wonderful meal, and our kids were there. Our grandson, Nicholas, about 8 months old, was there. And so we ate, sat down at the table, and in about 45 minutes we're getting up. And he's shocked. And in another hour, everybody's leaving. And he asked Candace, he said, is something wrong? Is there a problem? Is somebody upset? We said, yeah, we're tired of you. Leave, give us our grandson, and everybody else can go. He couldn't quite grasp this idea that you would eat in an hour and leave. Frankly, I have to admit it, the Lord here in verse 5 is acting more like a Chilean than a North American. He's preparing this feast. In fact, Spurgeon wrote on this text, and I quote him, he carefully, patiently takes the tablecloth and unfolds it, and the plates of the feast are displayed as on ordinary occasions. Nothing is hurried. There is no panic, no disturbance. Nothing is rushed. But the enemy is at the door. However, the Lord prepares the table, and the Christian sits down and eats as if everything were in perfect peace. No need to panic. The shepherd is in total control, even when you're surrounded by enemies. Notice, again, verse 5, he says, you anoint my head with oil. Now that doesn't sound interesting to any of us. You anoint, you pour oil on our heads. What does he mean? Well, one author that I read talked about how sheep are especially troubled by nasal flies, little flies that buzz around the sheep's head, attempting to deposit their eggs on the damp nose of the sheep. If they're successful, the eggs will hatch, and in a few days they'll form small, slender larvae that will burrow into the nasal passages, into the ears of the sheep. It becomes so agonizing to sheep that the shepherd will notice, and he's always on the lookout, will rub their heads against trees. They'll butt their heads on rocks in this frenzied attempt to rid themselves of the aggravation. In fact, in advanced stages, if the shepherd's not careful or watching, this can lead to blindness. Now, in the summertime, sheep are prone to something called the scab or scabies. It's a microscopic parasite that proliferates in warm weather, causing skin infection. In fact, if you go back into the Old Testament and you read how the lambs who would be offered for sacrifices had to be unblemished, more than likely Old Testament scholars believe it related to scabies. They couldn't have any kind of skin infections from this parasite in order to be sacrificed. They had then the sense that this scabies represented contamination, and it became a picture of sin. So they had to be clear of any of this. I can remember as a college student, it was my freshman year. In fact, it was winter break. And over Christmas, I was working in a field for a man. I needed to pick up some extra money, and he had a couple of acres, and he needed it all cleared, stumps, rocks. And so I worked for him. I was pulling out the vines and the stumps and the rocks, and spent Christmas break doing that before heading back to college. A few days after I got back to college, I noticed that I had some red spots around my waist, and they really itched. I knew it. I had picked up poison ivy. I'd pulled those vines up, and I had a case of it. That's all I needed going into the late winter and spring. I waited, hoping it would just miraculously go away. It didn't. It just grew. I didn't want to go to the campus doctor because I knew he would probably give me a shot, and I hate needles. I don't like shots at all. But it continued to grow up toward my chest, and it itched so badly I thought I got to get rid of this poison ivy. And so I went to the campus doctor, and he took a look at me and he said, "Yeah, son, you've got poison ivy, and what you need is a shot." So he gave me a shot, and it was filled with Miracle-Gro because it just continued to spread. Came upward around my waist toward my back. It itched so badly, expanded. A couple of weeks later, it was getting worse, and I went back to the doctor, and he said to me, the campus doctor, they're free. The campus doctor said, "You've got the most unusual case of poison ivy I've ever seen. I know what you need. A shot." So he gave me another shot. And again, it just continued to spread. Spring was arriving, and the weather there in Tennessee was turning warm and humid. And I was in a small Baptist college that required during the morning classes for guys to wear neckties. I can't tell you how horrible that was because this had spread upward toward my neck, and I'd leave my button unbuttoned and my necktie hanging low, and I had to walk a few blocks from my house dorm to campus, and I can't tell you how just a little sweat on my back, what that did to the agonizing itching that I had nonstop. My girlfriend begged me to go to a real doctor, one that had graduated from medical school, evidently, and take care of it. They cost money. I didn't have any money. I think it was like $40. I didn't have $40. That was a king's ransom. And so I just thought, it'll take care of itself. And I moved out of my house dorm, which didn't have air conditioning, and literally moved into the clinic because it had air conditioning. And at night, I would cover myself with calamine lotion. It had now reached around my arms, all the way up to my neck, on my back. And I would cover myself and lie there, unable to sleep. I began skipping classes. My grades began to drop. They didn't have far to go to fall, but they began to drop. And it was agonizing. And finally, my girlfriend won the argument. And I said, "Okay, I'll go to a real doctor." When I got into the examination room, I told the doctor, "I've got poison ivy from another planet. This is the worst thing you've ever seen." And he said, "Well, lift your shirt." I lifted my shirt. He took out a magnifying glass, and he held it up to me, and he said, "Son, you don't have poison ivy." He said, what you've got is, you've got this microscopic parasite. You picked it up in a field somewhere. You've been out in the field lately? I said, "Yeah." You picked it up in a field somewhere, and it's been roaming around your body, laying eggs and multiplying. I know exactly what you need. You need a shot. He gave me a shot, gave me prescription ointment, and that night, for the first time in months, I slept. I rested. He told me what I had was something called scabies. I was at that moment, and didn't know it then until I studied this psalm, more like a sheep, literally, than I'd ever been in my life, because that's what they get. And I also realized, obviously, I can't solve my problem. It's only going to grow worse. I need a really close, upfront encounter with a good doctor. For sheep, they could go blind. In fact, they can fatally take their heads and hit stumps and rocks and trees unless they have a close encounter with a good shepherd. And David knew what that would mean. And so that shepherd is on the lookout for a troubled sheep, and the representation of contamination, which for us is sin, a troubled conscience, guilt. That shepherd would pull that sheep close to him, and he'd take out his flask, and he had in that flask a homemade ointment made of a mixture of sulfur, some spices, a little tar, olive oil, and he would rub it over the afflicted area of that sheep, and it would kill those parasites. Now today, from what I understand, they'll literally dip sheep in these large vats with parasite-killing liquid. But even to this day, most modern shepherds prefer to deal with the head of their sheep by hand. David is referring in this text to anointing the head. He says, "You, Yahweh, anoint my head with oil." That is, I'm troubled by sin. I'm troubled by a guilty conscience. I'm troubled with the contamination of who I am. And you know that, and you pull me close, and with your own hands, healing, forgiving hands, you cleanse me. And what a relief, because you know what he says next? Look, you anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. In other words, life doesn't get any better than when I'm cleansed, than when sin is taken care of. And he deals with us abundantly, above anything we could ever ask or think, dealing with who we are, Ephesians 3:20. He pours on us lavishly His grace, Ephesians 1:8. He's ready, ever ready. And David says, I can rest. Life is so good when I'm forgiven. David begins his final stanza in verse 6. Notice, surely goodness and mercy shall follow me. The Hebrew verb actually means that idea of follow is a little weak. It actually means to pursue. Surely goodness and mercy shall pursue after me. I love this idea. I can't remember which author it was, but you have the shepherd in front of you. I think it was Spurgeon who said, and you have these two faithful sheepdogs behind you. And what are their names? The name of one sheepdog is goodness. That's the Hebrew word for abundant care. And then the other sheepdog is mercy. That's the word chesed. That's the idea of unbreakable commitment and promises. So look behind you. And what do you see? You have the shepherd in front of you, and behind you come God's care. As difficult as your life may have been, what do you see? Well, God was caring for me. God was merciful to me. He was committed in His faithful covenant to me. And don't you love the fact that David settled a question that every believer might wonder? Is God's goodness and mercy following after me every other day? Or every other month? Or when I deserve it? That's when those sheepdogs are trailing behind. When I deserve it. No. Look. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. That's the good days and the bad days. The days when you're faithful to your shepherd and unfaithful to your shepherd. Days of when you have money to pay the bills and days when you don't. Days when you feel loved and days when you feel forgotten. Days of good health. Days when health is taken away. Who's behind these two sheepdogs pursuing after you? Goodness and mercy. And guess what? David sings his closing lyric, when I come to the end of my days, notice he says, I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. I love this. He says, I'm going to change locations, but not shepherds. In case you've forgotten, you remember the psalm began with, the Lord is my shepherd. Yahweh is my shepherd. And now he ends by saying, I'm going to live with my shepherd forever. But did you notice the subtle shift here from pasture to a house? Did you catch that? David is now indoors. This is the Father's house. This is the Lord's palace of gold and his never-ending kingdom. Because one of these days I'm going to leave all that out there. No more valleys of dark shadows, no more enemies, no more sin, no more guilt, no more struggle. I'm moving inside the house of Yahweh, this palace, this house of the Father, who is my living Lord. Let me paraphrase this psalm and bring some of the nuances of truth we've learned together over these past 3 sessions by translating it, paraphrasing it. David sings, hey everybody, look who my shepherd is. It's the Lord. He is my personal leader. I don't lack anything he wants me to have. He makes it possible for me to lie down in green pastures. He leads my timid soul to quiet water. He restores my soul as he stands me back up on my feet time and time again. He leads me in the wagon tracks, the ruts of rightness with God for his reputation's sake. Even though I end up walking through valleys of deathly shadows, I fear no evil, because you're with me. Your rod protects me. Your staff holds my hand. You prepare a mesa before me right in the middle of my enemies, and then you anoint my head with cleansing, forgiving oil, and my cup is simply overflowing with gladness. And then goodness and mercy, they pursue after me every single day of my life. And then when my days are done, I'm going to trade a pasture for a palace and dwell in the house of my shepherd, my king, forever. Father, thank you for providing for us this song, for the way that it applies to our life, no matter where we are, no matter what station in life, from an incoming freshman to a graduating senior, to staff, faculty, board members, guests. We so often focus on the elements of the valley and not the faithfulness of our shepherd. We so often are reticent to come to you for confession and cleansing, and you stand ready with your flask, the remedy of our sin. I pray that today we would make things right with you, and we would walk with you. We would be pleased with you. We would enjoy you. And we would thank you for your faithfulness and your love toward us. We thank you in Jesus' name.